In the packed courtroom of Riverside County Superior Court, my sister Delilah stood before the bench in handcuffs, her designer suit wrinkled from a night in jail, as I adjusted my judicial robes and looked down at her from my position as the Honorable Judge Cassandra Whitmore. 23 years after she told our entire family that I was too stupid for college and would never amount to anything, the same woman who had sabotaged my scholarship applications was now forced to address me as Your Honor while facing federal fraud charges. What she didn't know was that I had been the anonymous tip that led to her arrest, armed with evidence I'd been collecting for over a decade of her illegal business practices. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The journey to that courtroom moment began in the small industrial town of Millbrook Falls, Ohio, where I grew up as the younger daughter of Thomas and Ruth Whitmore. Our father owned a modest auto repair shop, while our mother worked part-time at the local library. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable, and both our parents valued education above all else. They had high hopes for both their daughters, dreams that would be tested by the toxic dynamic that developed between Delilah and me from our earliest years. Delilah was 3 years older, naturally charismatic, and effortlessly popular. She sailed through high school with decent grades, an active social life, and the kind of confident charm that made adults assume she was destined for success. I, on the other hand, was the quiet bookworm who spent lunch periods in the library, earned straight A's through relentless studying, and had exactly 3 close friends throughout my entire high school career. Where Delilah was naturally gifted at making people like her, I had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. The contrast between us might have been manageable if Delilah had been content with her own strengths. Instead, she seemed to view my academic achievements as a personal threat to her position as the family's golden child. Every report card that showed my perfect grades was met with Delilah's dismissive comments. "Book smart doesn't mean life smart, Cassie. You'll see." When I won the state mathematics competition junior year, she told our parents, "It's just memorization. Real intelligence is being able to connect with people." But the real damage began during my senior year when I started applying for college scholarships. With my parents' limited income, financial aid would be crucial for my dreams of attending law school someday. I had my sights on Northwestern University's pre-law program, and my guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, assured me I was a strong candidate for their merit-based scholarship. I spent months perfecting my application essays, gathering recommendation letters, and preparing for interviews. That's when Delilah's jealousy took a darker turn. She had already enrolled at the local community college and was living at home, ostensibly to save money, but really because she lacked direction or ambition. Watching me prepare for what she saw as escape from Millbrook Falls seemed to trigger something vicious in her personality. The casual put-downs became more frequent and more cutting. She started questioning my college plans in front of our parents, planting seeds of doubt about whether I was really college material or just good at taking tests. "Cassie thinks she's going to be some big-shot lawyer, but she can barely order food at restaurants without stuttering. How's she going to argue cases in court?" These comments were delivered with just enough humor that our parents treated them as typical sibling teasing, but I could see the calculation behind them. Delilah was systematically undermining my confidence while positioning herself as the more practical, realistic daughter. The first major sabotage happened in February of my senior year. I had carefully prepared my scholarship application for Northwestern, triple-checking every document and deadline. The application was due on February 15th, and I had everything ready to mail by February 10th to ensure it arrived on time. But when I went to retrieve my application packet from my desk the morning I planned to send it, the entire folder was missing. I tore my room apart searching for it, growing increasingly panicked as the hours passed. When I finally asked my family if they'd seen it, Delilah was the picture of helpful concern. "Oh no, Cassie. Are you sure you didn't accidentally throw it away? You were cleaning your room yesterday." She even helped me search, going through wastebaskets and checking under furniture with apparent dedication. It wasn't until 3 days later that I found the application packet, in Delilah's bedroom closet, hidden behind a box of old textbooks. When I confronted her, she claimed she'd borrowed it to look at as an example for her own future applications, and had forgotten to return it. She seemed genuinely apologetic, even tearful, and our parents accepted her explanation as thoughtless rather than malicious.
But it was too late. The deadline had passed, and Northwestern's scholarship office was inflexible about late applications. Mrs. Patterson helped me contact them to explain the situation, but they had hundreds of qualified applicants who had met the deadline. My dream of attending Northwestern evaporated, along with my best shot at the scholarship money that would have made it possible. The pattern continued throughout the spring. My application to Ohio State University mysteriously arrived with smudged essays that had to be reprinted and resubmitted. My interview appointment with Case Western University was somehow canceled. They claimed someone had called, pretending to be me, saying I was no longer interested in attending. Each incident was individually explainable as miscommunication or accident, but together they formed a clear pattern of sabotage. By graduation, my college options had dwindled to the local state school with partial financial aid. It was a decent education, but not the springboard to law school I had planned. Delilah, meanwhile, had enrolled in business classes at the community college and started dating Ryan Hartwell, whose father owned the largest car dealership in the county. She seemed to take particular pleasure in my reduced circumstances, offering false sympathy while making sure everyone knew about my failed college plans. "Poor Cassie," she'd say to relatives at family gatherings. She had such big dreams about becoming a lawyer, but I guess reality had other plans. Sometimes you have to accept your limitations. The words were delivered with sisterly concern, but the satisfaction in her eyes was unmistakable. Our parents, caught between their daughters, tried to maintain neutrality. They encouraged me to make the best of my situation while avoiding direct confrontation with Delilah about the suspicious pattern of mishaps that had derailed my original plans. "Family is family," our mother would say whenever tensions rose. "You girls need to support each other, not compete." But I wasn't competing anymore. I was planning. Even as I enrolled at Millbrook State University, even as I watched Delilah bask in what she saw as her victory over my ambitions, I was already formulating a longer-term strategy. If she wanted to play games with my future, I would make sure I understood the rules better than she did. The quiet, studious girl she had systematically undermined was about to become something she never anticipated, a patient, methodical opponent who wouldn't forget what had been done to her. As I sat in my dorm room that first night of college, surrounded by the modest belongings that represented my scaled-back dreams, I made myself a promise. Delilah thought she had won by keeping me local, by limiting my options, by proving that her social advantages would always trump my academic achievements. She had no idea that she had actually given me something far more valuable than Northwestern University could have given me: absolute clarity about who my real enemy was, and unlimited time to plan my response. The girl who was too stupid for college was about to begin a journey that would eventually lead to a law degree, a judicial appointment, and a front-row seat to watch her sister's world crumble. But first, I had to survive 4 years of Delilah's continued efforts to keep me in my place, all while building the foundation for a revenge she would never see coming.
That conversation changed everything. Dr. Reeves introduced me to the concept of building a comprehensive academic profile that would make me competitive for full scholarships to top-tier law schools. It wasn't just about grades, though those remained crucial, but about developing a record of leadership, community service, and practical legal experience that would distinguish me from other applicants. I threw myself into this project with the same methodical determination I'd always applied to my studies, but now with a clear long-term strategy. I joined the mock trial team, where my natural attention to detail and thorough preparation style proved invaluable. I volunteered at the campus legal aid clinic, helping low-income residents with basic legal paperwork and learning firsthand how the law could be used to protect vulnerable people. Most importantly, I began working part-time at the law office of Henderson and Associates, a small firm in downtown Millbrook Falls that specialized in family law and criminal defense. Attorney Sarah Henderson hired me initially just to file documents and answer phones, but she quickly recognized my capabilities and began giving me more substantive responsibilities. I researched case law, helped prepare briefs, and even accompanied her to court proceedings as an observer. These experiences were eye-opening in ways I hadn't expected. Watching Attorney Henderson argue cases, I realized that effective legal advocacy wasn't about natural charisma or social charm. The qualities Delilah had always insisted were more important than book learning. It was about thorough preparation, logical argument, and the ability to think systematically under pressure. These were exactly the skills I had been developing my entire academic life. Meanwhile, Delilah's life seemed to be following a predictable trajectory that she clearly found satisfying. She had completed her associate degree in business administration with decent but unremarkable grades and had immediately begun working at Hartwell Motors, Ryan's family dealership. Her official title was marketing coordinator, but everyone in town knew she had been hired because of her relationship with the owner's son rather than her qualifications. Not that this arrangement bothered Delilah. She seemed perfectly content to leverage her personal connections for professional advancement, and she made no secret of her belief that this approach was more practical than my academic pursuits. Networking is everything in the real world. She'd lecture me during holiday visits home. You can have all the book knowledge you want, but if you don't know how to work with people, you'll never get anywhere. She had a point about networking, but her understanding of it was limited to social relationships and personal charm. She didn't seem to grasp that I was building my own network, one based on professional competence and shared intellectual interests rather than family connections and romantic relationships. My professors were writing recommendation letters for scholarship applications. Attorney Henderson was teaching me practical skills that would serve me throughout my legal career. My mock trial teammates were future lawyers, judges, and legal scholars who would remember my work ethic and analytical abilities long after graduation. By my sophomore year, the contrast between our paths was becoming more apparent, though Delilah still viewed herself as the clear winner in our unspoken competition. She had moved into a luxury apartment with Ryan and was driving a new car courtesy of Hartwell Motors employee benefits. Her social media was filled with photos from charity galas and business networking events where she appeared glamorous and successful. I, meanwhile, was still living in student housing and working multiple part-time jobs to cover expenses my partial scholarship didn't include. My social media, when I bothered to update it, showed study groups, mock trial competitions, and volunteer work at the legal aid clinic. To outside observers, especially family members, it probably looked like Delilah had chosen the smarter path. But I was beginning to see something that Delilah couldn't. The fundamental difference between building a career on personal relationships versus building one on professional competence. Her position at Hartwell Motors was entirely dependent on her romantic relationship with Ryan. If that relationship ended, her career prospects would evaporate overnight. My growing expertise in legal research, trial preparation, and client advocacy, however, would transfer to any legal environment and would only become more valuable over time. More significantly, I was starting to understand how the legal system actually worked, and I was beginning to see opportunities that someone focused purely on social advancement might miss. During my work at Henderson and Associates, I had witnessed several cases involving business fraud, tax evasion, and regulatory violations. I learned how these cases were built, what kind of evidence prosecutors needed, and how seemingly successful businesses could be hiding serious legal vulnerabilities. This knowledge became particularly relevant when I started noticing irregularities in Delilah's stories about her work at Hartwell Motors. She would casually mention customer financing arrangements that sounded questionable, inventory management practices that seemed designed to avoid taxes, and warranty policies that appeared to violate consumer protection laws. At the time, I filed these observations away without fully understanding their significance, but they were the beginning of my education in how successful-seeming businesses could be built on illegal foundations.
By my junior year, I had achieved something that would have seemed impossible during my high school scholarship disasters. I was ranked first in my class, had been accepted into the honors program, and had received preliminary encouragement from admissions counselors at several top-tier law schools. My LSAT prep scores were in the 95th percentile, and Dr. Reeves was confident I would be competitive for full scholarships at schools that had seemed hopelessly out of reach just 3 years earlier. Delilah's reaction to this academic success was predictably dismissive. "Good for you, Cassie," she'd say with that same condescending smile I remembered from high school. "I'm sure you'll do great in whatever small-town law office will hire you after graduation. Not everyone needs to set their sights too high." The assumption that my academic achievements would translate only to modest local opportunities revealed how little Delilah understood about the legal profession or my actual trajectory. She was thinking in terms of the limited career options available in Millbrook Falls, not recognizing that law school would open doors to opportunities far beyond our hometown's horizons. But I didn't correct her misconceptions. Instead, I continued to let her believe that I was following a predictable, unremarkable path that posed no threat to her self-image as the family's real success story. It was easier to let her maintain her illusions while I quietly built the foundation for achievements that would eventually force her to confront the reality of what I had become. The girl she had dismissed as too stupid for college was about to graduate summa cum laude and enter law school with a full scholarship. But Delilah wouldn't learn about that until it was too late to undermine it. This time, I had learned to keep my most important plans to myself. The moment that would change everything happened on a rainy Thursday evening in October of my senior year. I was working late at Henderson & Associates, helping Attorney Henderson prepare for a complex fraud case involving a local construction company. We had been reviewing financial documents for hours, and my eyes were burning from staring at spreadsheets and invoices under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Cassie, would you mind running these contracts to the copy center before they close?" Attorney Henderson asked, handing me a thick stack of documents. "I need 3 sets for tomorrow's depositions, and our office copier is acting up again." I grabbed my coat and headed out into the drizzle, grateful for the excuse to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. The copy center was just 2 blocks away, nestled between a coffee shop and a small accounting firm in one of downtown Millbrook Falls' older brick buildings. As I pushed through the glass door, shaking raindrops from my jacket, I nearly collided with someone coming out of the back office. It was Jake Morrison, a guy I'd known peripherally since high school. He'd been a year ahead of me and had always seemed like a decent person, though we'd never been close friends. What surprised me was seeing him here at all. Last I'd heard, he was working as a mechanic at one of the local auto shops. "Cassie, wow, I haven't seen you in forever," Jake said, his face lighting up with genuine warmth. "How's college treating you?" "Pretty well, actually. Just finishing up my senior year," I replied, shifting the stack of legal documents to my other arm. "What about you? Are you working here now?" Jake's expression grew more serious, and he glanced around the empty copy center before lowering his voice. "Actually, I'm here on some business that, well, it's kind of complicated. Do you have a few minutes? There's something I think you should know about, especially since you're studying law and all." Something in his tone caught my attention. Jake had always been straightforward, not the type to create drama or exaggerate situations. If he thought something was important enough to discuss, it probably was. "Sure, what's going on?" "It's about your sister and that dealership she works for," Jake began, then paused as if choosing his words carefully. "Look, I don't want to cause family problems for you, but some stuff has been happening that, well, it's not right, and I think someone needs to know about it." My stomach tightened. Over the past year, I had noticed inconsistencies in Delilah's stories about her work, but I had dismissed them as either exaggeration or my own misunderstanding of how car dealerships operated. "Can you be more specific? What kind of stuff?" Jake looked around again, then gestured toward a small seating area in the corner of the copy center. "Can we sit down? This is going to take a few minutes to explain properly." We settled into the uncomfortable plastic chairs, and Jake began to tell me a story that would shatter my understanding of what my sister had really been doing for the past 3 years. It started with his cousin Maria, a single mother who worked 2 jobs to support her young daughter. Maria had been saving for months to buy a reliable used car, and she had gone to Hartwell Motors based on their reputation and advertising promises of honest dealing with working families.
Maria found this Honda Civic, maybe 8 years old. Seemed like it was in good condition, Jake explained.
The salesman told her it had one previous owner, no accidents, regular maintenance. Your sister was the one who handled all the paperwork, the financing arrangements, everything. The deal had seemed reasonable at first. Maria put down $2,000 and signed up for monthly payments that fit her tight budget. But within 3 weeks of driving the car off the lot, problems started appearing. The transmission began slipping, the brake pads were worn down to nothing, and a mechanic discovered that the odometer had been rolled back by at least 50,000 miles. When Maria tried to return the car or get them to fix the problems, your sister told her that all sales were final and that any mechanical issues weren't covered by their warranty, Jake continued, his voice growing angry. But here's the thing, Cassie. I know cars, and I know that Honda. I worked on it about 6 months before Maria bought it. Jake had been employed at Peterson's Auto Repair when the car came in with severe transmission problems and brake system issues. The owner had decided the repairs would cost more than the car was worth and had sold it to a salvage company for parts. Somehow, that same car had ended up on Hartwell Motors' lot with cosmetic improvements, rolled back mileage, and a fraudulent history. That's not the worst part, Jake said, pulling out his phone and showing me a photo. Look at this. The image showed a document that made my blood run cold. It was Maria's financing agreement, but the terms were completely different from what she had described. Instead of the reasonable monthly payments she thought she had agreed to, the contract showed payments nearly double that amount, with interest rates that bordered on predatory lending. Your sister told Maria the payments would be $180 a month, but look at this contract. It says $340 a month. When Maria pointed out the discrepancy, your sister claimed that Maria had misunderstood and that the higher amount was what they had always discussed. I stared at the document, my legal training immediately recognizing several violations of consumer protection laws, truth in lending regulations, and possibly criminal fraud statutes. But what shocked me even more was seeing Delilah's signature on multiple lines, clearly indicating her direct involvement in creating and executing these deceptive contracts. "How did you get a copy of this?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Maria brought it to me because she didn't know what else to do. She can't afford a lawyer, and she was scared that if she stopped making payments, they'd destroy her credit and maybe even have her arrested. I told her I'd help her figure out what to do, so I started asking around. That's when Jake had discovered that Maria's experience wasn't isolated. Over the past 2 years, at least 6 other people had similar stories involving Hartwell Motors. Cars with hidden damage, rolled back odometers, deceptive financing terms, and aggressive collection practices when customers tried to complain or return vehicles. In every case, Delilah had been the primary point of contact for the paperwork and financial arrangements. The thing is, Cassie, I don't think this is just your sister going rogue. This seems like it's systematic, like it's how they do business. But your sister is definitely the one making it happen on the paperwork side. Jake showed me more photos on his phone, documents, correspondence, even recordings that Maria had made of phone conversations with Delilah when she was trying to resolve her problems with the car. In one particularly damning recording, I could hear my sister's voice clearly stating that Maria had signed the contracts knowing the full terms and that any claims of deception were simply buyer's remorse. "I've been documenting all of this because I want to help these people," Jake explained, "but I'm not sure what to do with it. I mean, this looks like serious fraud to me, but I don't know how the legal system works or who I should report it to." I sat in stunned silence, processing what I had just learned. The sister who had spent years telling me I was too naive for the real world, who had positioned herself as more street smart and practical than my academic pursuits, was involved in systematic fraud that was devastating working families in our community. People like Maria, who worked 2 jobs and saved for months just to buy reliable transportation, were being deliberately victimized by schemes that Delilah was not only participating in, but apparently orchestrating. "Jake, I need you to know that this is incredibly serious," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "What you're describing isn't just unethical business practices, it's multiple felonies. Consumer fraud, odometer tampering, predatory lending violations, and possibly racketeering if it's as systematic as it sounds." Jake nodded grimly. "I figured it was bad, but I didn't know how bad. What do you think we should do?"
The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I was only beginning to understand. I thought about Maria and the other victims Jake had mentioned, people who were being cheated out of their hard-earned money by my own sister. I thought about Delilah's luxury lifestyle, her expensive clothes and fancy apartment, all apparently funded by schemes that preyed on vulnerable families.
But I also thought about my family, about the devastation this would cause if it became public, about the position it would put me in as someone studying law and working in the legal system. Could I really be the one to expose my own sister's criminal activities? Was I prepared for the consequences that would follow? I need some time to think about this, I told Jake honestly. This is bigger than I can process right now. Can you give me copies of everything you have? I want to review it carefully and figure out the best way to handle it. Jake agreed immediately, clearly relieved to have someone with legal knowledge taking the situation seriously. We arranged to meet the following evening so he could provide me with copies of all the documentation he had gathered. As we stood up to leave, he placed a hand on my shoulder. Cassie, I know this puts you in a terrible position, but these people are being hurt, and your sister is making it happen. Someone needs to stop it. As I walked back to the law office through the steady rain, the legal documents I had come to copy forgotten in my hands, I realized that Jake was right. Someone did need to stop it. And given my unique position, my legal training, my access to the court system through my work with Attorney Henderson, and my inside knowledge of Delilah's activities, that someone might have to be me. The question was whether I had the courage to destroy my own sister in order to protect the people she was victimizing. By the time I reached the office, I knew the answer, even though I wasn't ready to admit it yet. The girl Delilah had always dismissed as too weak and naive for the real world was about to discover just how strong she could be when innocent people needed protection. But first, I needed to see exactly how deep this corruption went, and whether Delilah was just a participant or the architect of something much larger and more dangerous than Jake had yet uncovered. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my narrow dorm bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through everything Jake had told me. The documents he'd shown me kept flashing through my thoughts. Maria's falsified contract, the rolled-back odometer readings, and most disturbing of all, Delilah's signature appearing throughout the paperwork like a criminal calling card. By 3 a.m., I had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 12 hours earlier. I was going to investigate my own sister's criminal activities with the same methodical thoroughness I applied to my legal studies. If Delilah was involved in systematic fraud, I needed to understand the full scope before deciding how to proceed. And if innocent people were being victimized, I had a moral obligation to gather the evidence that could stop it. The next morning, I called Attorney Henderson and asked if I could come in early to discuss a complex legal situation that had come to my attention. Sarah Henderson had become more than just an employer over the past 2 years. She was a mentor who had taught me that the law existed to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. If anyone would understand the ethical dilemma I was facing, it would be her. I arrived at the office before 7 a.m., bringing with me a carefully prepared summary of what Jake had revealed. Attorney Henderson listened without interruption as I outlined the allegations against Hartwell Motors, though I initially referred to Delilah only as an employee rather than my sister. When I finished, Henderson leaned back in her chair with a grave expression. Cassie, what you're describing represents multiple felony violations: consumer fraud, odometer tampering, truth in lending violations, and potentially racketeering charges if this is as systematic as it sounds. These aren't minor regulatory infractions. We're talking about crimes that could result in decades of prison time. I took a deep breath before revealing the personal connection that made this situation so complicated. There's something else you need to know.
The employee who's apparently orchestrating these schemes, it's my sister, Delilah. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained professionally neutral. I see. That certainly complicates matters, but it doesn't change the legal reality of what you've described. If these allegations are accurate, your sister is committing serious crimes that are harming vulnerable people. What should I do? I asked, though I suspected I already knew her answer. It depends on what kind of lawyer you want to be, Henderson replied carefully. Some attorneys view family loyalty as paramount, regardless of legal considerations. Others believe that our highest obligation is to justice and the protection of innocent people. You need to decide which principle matters to you. She paused before continuing. However, I will say this. If you choose to pursue this investigation, you need to be absolutely certain of your facts before taking any action. Accusations of criminal fraud, especially against family members, can destroy relationships permanently. Make sure you're prepared for all the consequences.
I left that meeting with a clear understanding of what I needed to do. Henderson was right. I needed to be certain of my facts. That meant conducting a thorough investigation using all the legal research skills I had developed over the past 4 years. It also meant accepting that this investigation might uncover evidence that would force me to choose between my sister and my principles. My first step was meeting with Jake Morrison to review all the evidence he had collected. We arranged to meet at a small diner outside of town, away from potential witnesses who might recognize either of us. Jake arrived with a thick folder containing documents, photographs, and audio recordings that painted a disturbing picture of systematic fraud at Hartwell Motors. The evidence was more extensive than I had initially realized. Jake had documented at least 8 separate cases over the past 2 years, involving victims ranging from college students buying their first cars to elderly couples seeking reliable transportation on fixed incomes. In every case, the pattern was remarkably consistent. Customers were shown vehicles with hidden damage or mechanical problems, given false information about the car's histories, and pressured into signing financing agreements with deceptive terms. What made the evidence particularly damning was how clearly it showed Delilah's central role in executing these schemes. Her signature appeared on virtually every fraudulent document, and the audio recordings Jake had obtained demonstrated her sophisticated knowledge of how to manipulate customers and conceal the dealership's deceptive practices. In one particularly disturbing recording, I heard Delilah coaching another employee on how to handle customers who complained about their vehicles. Never admit fault, never acknowledge the problems they're claiming, and always insist that they're trying to get out of a contract they willingly signed. Most people will give up rather than fight us, especially if they think it might hurt their credit. The cold calculation in her voice was chilling. This wasn't someone who had been pressured into participating in illegal activities. This was someone who understood exactly what she was doing and had developed systematic methods for victimizing people while avoiding accountability. But Jake's investigation had also revealed something even more disturbing. The fraud at Hartwell Motors appeared to extend beyond individual car sales into organized schemes involving false insurance claims, tax evasion, and money laundering. Jake had discovered evidence suggesting that the dealership was reporting inflated repair costs to insurance companies, claiming tax deductions for charitable donations that had never been made, and moving money through a network of shell companies to hide the proceeds from their fraudulent activities. "I think this goes all the way to the top," Jake told me, as we reviewed bank records he had somehow obtained. "Ryan Hartwell might be the owner's son, but he's not smart enough to organize something this sophisticated. And his father is semi-retired, barely involved in day-to-day operations anymore." The implication was clear.
Delilah wasn't just participating in someone else's criminal enterprise. She appeared to be the primary architect of an increasingly complex fraud operation that was generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal profits annually. As Jake continued explaining his findings, I realized that Delilah had transformed herself into something I had never imagined. A sophisticated white-collar criminal who was using her position at Hartwell Motors to operate what amounted to an organized crime syndicate focused on consumer fraud and financial manipulation. The scope of what Jake had uncovered was overwhelming, but it also presented me with an opportunity I hadn't anticipated. If Delilah was indeed the mastermind behind these operations, then she had made herself extremely vulnerable to prosecution. White-collar criminals often believed they were too smart to be caught, but they typically left extensive paper trails that could be used to build airtight cases against them. I spent the next several days developing a systematic approach to gathering additional evidence. Using the research skills I had developed through my legal training, I began investigating public records, business filings, and financial documents that might corroborate Jake's findings. I also reached out to other potential victims through carefully worded social media posts and community bulletin boards, asking if anyone had experienced problems with local car dealerships. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a week, I had been contacted by more than a dozen additional victims of Hartwell Motors' fraudulent practices. Each person had a similar story: deceptive sales practices, falsified paperwork, and aggressive tactics when they tried to complain or seek remedies. Several had documentation that clearly showed Delilah's involvement in their cases. More importantly, some of these victims had attempted to report their experiences to local authorities, only to be told that individual consumer complaints were difficult to prosecute without evidence of systematic criminal activity. The scattered nature of the complaints had prevented law enforcement from recognizing the coordinated nature of the fraud operation. But I was beginning to see the bigger picture that individual victims couldn't perceive. By collecting and organizing evidence from multiple cases, I was documenting a criminal enterprise that extended far beyond isolated incidents of deceptive sales practices. This was systematic fraud on a scale that would definitely interest federal prosecutors, particularly given the interstate nature of some of the financial transactions Jake had uncovered. As I compiled my evidence, I also began to understand something else. The luxury lifestyle that Delilah had been flaunting for the past 3 years wasn't funded by legitimate business success or even simple sales commissions. It was built on the systematic victimization of working families who had trusted her to help them purchase reliable transportation.
Every expensive dinner she had posted on social media, every designer outfit she had worn to family gatherings, every luxury vacation she had taken with Ryan, all of it had been paid for with money stolen from people like Maria, who worked 2 jobs just to afford basic transportation for herself and her daughter. The realization filled me with a cold anger that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Delilah hadn't just committed crimes. She had built her entire adult identity around wealth obtained through the deliberate victimization of vulnerable people. And she had done it while lecturing me about being naive and unrealistic about how the world really worked. By the end of that week, I had accumulated enough evidence to support multiple felony charges against my sister, and potentially against Ryan Hartwell and others involved in the operation. The question was no longer whether crimes had been committed, but how to proceed with information that could destroy my family while protecting the people who had been victimized. I realized I was approaching a point of no return. Once I took this evidence to law enforcement, there would be no way to control what happened next. Delilah would face arrest, prosecution, and almost certainly prison time. Our family would be devastated,
our relationships would be permanently altered, and I would be known forever as the sister who had destroyed Delilah's life. But as they looked through the files of victims Jake and I had documented, Maria and her young daughter, elderly couples on fixed incomes, young families struggling to build better lives, I realized that some choices were actually very simple. Delilah had made her decisions when she chose to victimize innocent people. Now I had to make mine about whether to protect her or protect her victims. The girl who had supposedly been too weak and naive for the real world was about to discover exactly how strong she could be when justice demanded it. The breakthrough that would expose the full extent of Delilah's criminal enterprise came from an unexpected source: Tommy Chen, a former Hartwell Motors employee who had been fired 3 months earlier under suspicious circumstances. Jake had mentioned Tommy in passing during one of our evidence review sessions, noting that several victims had mentioned his name as someone who had tried to warn them about problems with their vehicles before the sales were finalized. I found Tommy working at a small independent garage on the outskirts of Millbrook Falls, a modest operation that specialized in honest repairs for working-class customers. When I introduced myself and explained that I was investigating fraudulent practices at Hartwell Motors, his reaction was immediate and intense. "Finally," he said, setting down his wrench and wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "I've been waiting for someone to start asking the right questions about that place. I tried to report what I saw to the Better Business Bureau, but they said they needed more than just employee complaints to take action." Tommy invited me into the garage's small office, where he proceeded to tell me a story that revealed how Delilah had systematically corrupted what had once been a legitimate family business. When Tommy first started working at Hartwell Motors 2 years ago, the dealership had operated with typical industry practices, not perfect, but generally honest in their dealings with customers. The old man, Frank Hartwell, he ran things by the book. Sure, we'd try to maximize profit margins like any business, but we weren't deliberately cheating people. If a car had problems, we'd disclose them. If financing terms changed, we'd explain why. It was straight business. But everything had changed when Delilah was promoted to finance manager and given control over the dealership's paperwork and customer relations. According to Tommy, she had arrived at the position with what seemed like sophisticated knowledge of automotive finance regulations and customer protection laws, knowledge she used not to ensure compliance, but to identify ways to circumvent those protections. She studied those regulations like she was preparing for a test, but she was looking for loopholes, not trying to follow the rules. She'd find legal technicalities that let her get away with practices that were obviously designed to cheat people, even if they weren't technically illegal under the exact wording of the statutes. Tommy described watching Delilah gradually train other employees in deceptive practices, always framing them as sales techniques or customer management strategies rather than fraud. She had developed detailed scripts for handling customer complaints, methods for pressuring buyers into signing documents they hadn't fully read, and sophisticated systems for hiding vehicle defects during initial inspections. The scary thing was how smart she was about it. She never told anyone to break the law directly. Instead, she'd shown them how to accomplish the same result using methods that were hard to prosecute. Like, instead of lying about a car's accident history, she'd find ways to technically avoid the question or phrase answers in ways that were misleading but not false under legal definitions. But Tommy's most damaging revelation concerned the financial structure that Delilah had created to hide the proceeds from the dealership's fraudulent activities. She had convinced Ryan Hartwell to establish a series of subsidiary companies and consulting agreements that allowed them to move money through multiple accounts while avoiding taxes and regulatory oversight.
Ryan's not bright enough to understand what she was really doing, Tommy explained. She told him it was all about tax optimization and business efficiency. But I saw the paperwork, and it was obvious she was setting up a system to launder the money they were stealing from customers. Tommy had kept copies of several key documents before his termination, including internal memos where Delilah outlined her strategies for maximizing profits through what she euphemistically called aggressive customer management.
These documents were remarkably detailed, showing not just the mechanics of individual fraudulent transactions, but the overall criminal enterprise she had constructed. One particularly damning memo, dated just 6 months earlier, outlined Delilah's plans for expanding their operations into neighboring counties. She had identified several smaller dealerships that were struggling financially and had developed proposals for management consulting services that would essentially export her fraudulent practices to other businesses. She wasn't just running a scam at Hartwell Motors, Tommy said, showing me copies of the expansion documents. She was trying to build a network of dealerships, all using the same crooked methods, like franchising fraud operations. The scope of Delilah's criminal ambitions was staggering. She had essentially turned automotive fraud into a scalable business model, complete with training materials, operational procedures, and expansion strategies. The woman who had dismissed my academic achievements as impractical had applied sophisticated analytical thinking to create what amounted to a criminal enterprise. Tommy also revealed why he had been fired. He had started refusing to participate in transactions he recognized as fraudulent, and he had begun warning customers about problems with vehicles they were considering purchasing. When Delilah discovered his interference with her operations, she had convinced Ryan to terminate him for poor attitude and failure to support company sales objectives. "The day they fired me, your sister told me something I'll never forget," Tommy said, his voice growing angry. "She said that people like me and the customers we were dealing with deserved whatever happened to us because we weren't smart enough to protect ourselves. She actually believed that cheating people was justified because they were too naive to prevent it." This revelation provided crucial insight into Delilah's psychology and motivation. She hadn't simply stumbled into criminal behavior or been pressured by circumstances. She had developed a deliberate philosophy that rationalized victimizing vulnerable people as a form of natural selection. In her mind, fraud wasn't wrong. It was just intelligent people taking advantage of less intelligent ones. Tommy's documentation also revealed the financial scope of the operation. Based on the internal accounting records he had copied, Hartwell Motors had generated over $400,000 in fraudulent profits during the previous 18 months alone. The money had been distributed through the subsidiary companies Delilah had established, with significant portions going directly to her personal accounts. More disturbingly, the records showed that the fraudulent activities had accelerated dramatically over time. What had started as occasional deceptive practices had evolved into systematic criminal operations affecting nearly every customer transaction. Delilah had essentially turned the entire dealership into a criminal enterprise while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business operations. As Tommy continued sharing his evidence, I realized that my sister had accomplished something that would have impressed me if it hadn't been so morally reprehensible. She had created a sophisticated criminal organization using the same analytical and organizational skills that could have made her successful in legitimate business endeavors. The irony was overwhelming. Delilah had spent years telling me that I was too academic and naive for the real world, while she applied intellectual rigor and strategic thinking to build a criminal empire. She had been right that the real world required practical intelligence and systematic planning. She just chose to apply those skills to victimizing innocent people rather than creating legitimate value. By the time I left Tommy's garage, I had accumulated evidence that would support not just individual fraud charges against Delilah, but racketeering charges that could result in decades of prison time. The documentation showed a pattern of criminal activity that extended over multiple years, involved numerous victims, and demonstrated clear intent to expand the illegal operations to other businesses. But Tommy had also given me something else: contact information for 3 other former Hartwell Motors employees who had been terminated under suspicious circumstances. Each of them, according to Tommy, had witnessed different aspects of Delilah's criminal operations and had documentation that could further strengthen the case against her.
That evening, as I organized all the evidence Jake, Tommy, and I had collected, I realized that I was no longer investigating whether my sister had committed crimes. I was documenting the full scope of a criminal enterprise that had systematically victimized dozens of innocent people while generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal profits.
The question was no longer whether to report Delilah's activities to law enforcement. The evidence was too overwhelming and the harm to victims too severe to ignore. The question was how to ensure that when I did report her, the authorities would have everything they needed to completely dismantle her criminal operations and prevent her from harming anyone else. I was also beginning to understand that this case could have implications far beyond Delilah's prosecution. If handled properly, it could serve as a model for how to identify and prosecute similar fraud operations in other industries. The systematic nature of her crimes and the sophistication of her methods made this exactly the kind of case that could establish important legal precedents for protecting vulnerable consumers. The girl who had been dismissed as too weak and academic for the real world was about to bring down a criminal enterprise using the same methodical approach she had applied to her legal studies. But first, I needed to contact those other former employees and gather the final pieces of evidence that would make the case against Delilah absolutely unassailable. Because when I finally revealed what my sister had really been doing, I wanted to make sure that justice would be swift, complete, and impossible for her to escape through the same legal technicalities she had used to victimize so many others. Over the next 3 weeks, I systematically contacted each of the former employees Tommy had identified, and what I discovered exceeded even my worst expectations about the scope of Delilah's criminal operations. Each witness provided pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, revealed a criminal enterprise far more sophisticated and far-reaching than anything I had initially imagined. The first former employee I contacted was Linda Rodriguez, who had worked as a service advisor at Hartwell Motors for 8 months before being terminated for what Delilah had called failure to maintain customer satisfaction standards. When I met Linda at a coffee shop in the next town over, she immediately understood why I was asking questions. "I've been hoping someone would investigate that place," Linda said, pulling out a folder she had clearly prepared in advance. "I kept copies of everything because I knew what they were doing was wrong, but I didn't know how to prove it or who to report it to." Linda's evidence focused on an aspect of the fraud operation that neither Jake nor Tommy had fully understood: the systematic manipulation of service records and warranty claims. According to Linda, Delilah had developed a sophisticated system for generating false service documentation that supported the dealership's fraudulent sales practices. When customers brought cars back with problems, instead of fixing them properly, we were trained to create service records that made it look like the issues had been addressed. Delilah showed us how to write work orders that technically described repairs without actually requiring us to do the work. For example, if a customer complained about transmission problems, Linda would be instructed to create a service record indicating that the transmission had been inspected and adjusted to manufacturer specifications. The deliberately vague language suggested that actual repairs had been performed, but in reality, no mechanical work had been done. When customers returned with continued problems, Linda was trained to reference the previous repair as evidence that the issues were unrelated to the original defects. More disturbingly, Linda revealed that Delilah had established relationships with several questionable auto parts suppliers who would provide documentation for parts that had never been purchased or installed. These false parts records were used to support warranty claims with manufacturers and insurance companies, generating additional revenue through fraudulent reimbursements. "She had it all figured out," Linda said, showing me examples of the false documentation. "The parts suppliers would send us invoices for work we never did. We'd submit those invoices to insurance companies for reimbursement, and then we'd split the money with the suppliers. It was like a whole network of companies working together to steal from insurance companies." Linda's documentation showed that this insurance fraud operation had generated over $150,000 in false claims during her 8 months of employment alone.
The sophistication of the scheme was remarkable. Delilah had created a system that generated fraudulent profits from every aspect of the automotive business, from initial sales through ongoing service and warranty claims. The second former employee, Marcus Thompson, had worked in the dealership's finance office and had witnessed the most sophisticated aspects of Delilah's money laundering operations. Marcus had been terminated after asking too many questions about the complex web of subsidiary companies and consulting agreements that Delilah had established. "I have a degree in accounting," Marcus explained when we met at his new job at a small tax preparation firm. "What your sister was doing with those financial structures wasn't just aggressive tax planning, it was deliberate money laundering designed to hide the source of income and avoid regulatory oversight." Marcus had kept detailed records of the financial transactions he had been asked to process, including transfers between multiple business entities that appeared to serve no legitimate business purpose. According to his documentation, Delilah had established at least 7 different corporations and limited liability companies, all controlled by her and Ryan, but operating under different names and business classifications.
The money would come in from fraudulent sales and insurance claims, then get transferred through multiple accounts to make it look like legitimate consulting fees or business services, Marcus explained. By the time it reached their personal accounts, it looked like legal income from various business activities. The money laundering system was sophisticated enough to fool casual regulatory oversight, but Marcus's accounting expertise had allowed him to track the actual flow of funds through the various entities. His records showed that over $300,000 in fraudulent proceeds had been laundered through this system during his 6 months of employment. Most alarmingly, Marcus had discovered evidence that Delilah was already implementing her expansion plans. She had established consulting agreements with 3 other automotive businesses in neighboring counties, ostensibly to provide, quote, management optimization services. In reality, these agreements were mechanisms for exporting her fraudulent practices to other dealerships while taking a percentage of their illegal profits. She wasn't just running a local fraud operation, Marcus said. She was building a regional criminal network. Each dealership she consulted with started using the same deceptive practices, the same false documentation systems, and the same money laundering structures. It was like she was franchising fraud operations. The third former employee, Rebecca Walsh, had worked as a sales associate and witnessed Delilah's systematic training of other employees in deceptive sales practices. Rebecca's evidence was particularly valuable because it showed how Delilah had gradually normalized criminal behavior among the dealership's staff. "When I started working there, most of the salespeople were honest, but your sister had this way of gradually introducing more and more questionable practices, always framing them as standard industry techniques or competitive advantages," Rebecca explained. Rebecca had secretly recorded several training sessions where Delilah taught employees how to manipulate customers, conceal vehicle defects, and pressure buyers into signing contracts with deceptive terms. These recordings were devastating evidence of premeditated criminal activity, showing Delilah explicitly instructing employees to engage in practices she knew were fraudulent. In one particularly damning recording, I could hear Delilah explaining how to handle customers who tried to research vehicle histories. Never lie directly about accident reports or service records. Instead, distract them with other features, create time pressure by claiming other buyers are interested, and always emphasize that all sales are final once papers are signed. Most people are too polite or too intimidated to keep pushing for information they're entitled to have. Rebecca's evidence also revealed the psychological manipulation tactics Delilah had developed for targeting specific types of vulnerable customers. She had created detailed profiles for maximizing profit from different demographics: elderly customers who could be confused by complex financing terms, young buyers who could be impressed by cosmetic improvements that hid mechanical problems, and low-income families who could be pressured into accepting unfavorable terms by emphasizing their limited options.
She studied people like they were lab specimens, Rebecca said with obvious disgust. She had specific scripts for making elderly customers feel like they were getting special deals, techniques for making young buyers feel sophisticated and adult, and ways to make poor families feel grateful for the opportunity to buy cars that were essentially designed to break down. The combined evidence from these three witnesses painted a picture of criminal activity that extended far beyond simple consumer fraud. Delilah had created a comprehensive criminal enterprise that included systematic consumer deception, insurance fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and what amounted to organized crime involving multiple businesses across several counties. More significantly, the evidence showed clear intent to expand these operations regionally and possibly nationally. Delilah's consulting agreements and training materials suggested she was attempting to create a network of fraudulent automotive businesses that would generate illegal profits on an unprecedented scale. As I compiled all this evidence into a comprehensive file, I realized that I was documenting what federal prosecutors would likely consider one of the most sophisticated automotive fraud enterprises they had ever encountered. The systematic nature of the crimes, the complex financial structures involved, and the multi-state scope of the operations would almost certainly trigger federal jurisdiction and serious racketeering charges. But the evidence also revealed something else: the devastating impact Delilah's crimes had on vulnerable families throughout the region. The victims weren't just statistics. They were working parents, elderly couples, young families, and students who had trusted her to help them purchase reliable transportation. Instead, she had systematically victimized them while building a luxury lifestyle funded by their losses. The contrast between Delilah's public image as a successful businesswoman and the reality of her criminal operations was staggering. While she posted photos of expensive vacations and designer purchases on social media, families like Maria's were struggling to make payments on cars that had been deliberately sold to them with hidden defects and deceptive financing terms. I now had enough evidence to support federal charges that could result in decades of prison time for Delilah and the complete dismantling of her criminal network. The question was no longer whether to report her activities, but how to ensure that when I did, the prosecution would be swift, comprehensive, and would provide justice for all the victims she had harmed. The girl who had been dismissed as too naive and academic for the real world was about to demonstrate exactly how dangerous a methodical, well-educated opponent could be when motivated by justice. But first, I needed to make one final decision: whether to warn my family about what was coming or whether protecting the integrity of the investigation required keeping them in the dark until law enforcement was ready to act.
With overwhelming evidence of Delilah's criminal enterprise compiled, I faced the most critical decision of my life: how to ensure that justice would be served while protecting the integrity of what had become a complex federal investigation. The evidence I had gathered was extensive enough to bring down not just Delilah, but her entire network of fraudulent operations across multiple counties. However, presenting this information to law enforcement required careful strategic planning to prevent any possibility of evidence destruction or witness intimidation. My first step was scheduling a meeting with Attorney Henderson to review the complete evidence file and develop a prosecution strategy. When I arrived at her office with 3 banker's boxes full of documentation, recordings, and witness statements, Henderson's expression immediately turned grave. "Cassie, what you've compiled here represents one of the most comprehensive fraud investigations I've ever seen from a civilian," she said after spending 2 hours reviewing the evidence. "This level of documentation and analysis is frankly better than what I've seen from many law enforcement agencies. You've essentially built a complete federal case." Henderson's assessment confirmed my own analysis. The evidence supported charges under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, multiple counts of consumer fraud, insurance fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy. The multi-state nature of Delilah's operations and the systematic use of wire communications for fraudulent purposes brought the case clearly under federal jurisdiction. However, Henderson continued,
Given the scope and complexity of what you've uncovered, we need to approach this strategically. If your sister realizes she's under investigation, she could destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, or flee the jurisdiction. We need to present this to federal authorities in a way that ensures immediate action. Henderson recommended contacting Special Agent Patricia Kovac with the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, who had successfully prosecuted several major automotive fraud cases in the region. According to Henderson, Agent Kovac was known for her thorough approach to complex financial crimes and her ability to coordinate multi-agency investigations. Before making that contact, however, I needed to address a personal dilemma that had been weighing on me throughout this investigation: whether to warn my parents about what was coming. They had no knowledge of Delilah's criminal activities, and the shock of her arrest would be devastating. Yet warning them risked compromising the investigation if they felt compelled to alert Delilah, or if they simply couldn't maintain the necessary secrecy. After careful consideration, I decided to meet with my parents privately to prepare them for what was about to happen, but only after federal agents were ready to move immediately. This approach would minimize their emotional trauma while preventing any possibility of interfering with the investigation. My meeting with Agent Kovac took place the following Tuesday at the FBI field office in Columbus. I had driven the 2-hour distance carrying copies of all the evidence I'd compiled, organized into a comprehensive presentation that outlined the scope of Delilah's criminal enterprise and its impact on victims throughout the region. Agent Kovac was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who listened intently as I outlined my findings. Her questions were precise and demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both automotive fraud patterns and federal criminal statutes. When I finished my presentation, she leaned back in her chair with an expression of professional satisfaction. "Miss Whitmore, what you've documented here represents one of the most comprehensive fraud investigations I've ever seen from a civilian," she said after spending 2 hours reviewing the evidence. "This level of documentation and analysis is frankly better than what I've seen from many law enforcement agencies. You've essentially built a complete federal case." Henderson's assessment confirmed my own analysis. The evidence supported charges under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, multiple counts of consumer fraud, insurance fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy. The multi-state nature of Delilah's operations and the systematic use of wire communications for fraudulent purposes brought the case clearly under federal jurisdiction. However, Agent Kovac continued, given the scope and complexity of what you've uncovered, we need to approach this strategically. Criminal organizations like this are designed to allow rapid evidence destruction and asset flight. We'll be coordinating simultaneous raids on multiple locations, freezing bank accounts, and executing arrest warrants across 3 counties. The timeline Agent Kovac outlined was aggressive. Within a week, federal agents would have obtained all necessary warrants and coordinated with state and local authorities for simultaneous enforcement actions. Delilah would be arrested at Hartwell Motors during business hours to prevent any opportunity for evidence destruction. Ryan Hartwell and several other participants would be arrested simultaneously at their respective locations. Agent Kovac also explained that my role as a cooperating witness would be crucial throughout the prosecution process. The evidence I had gathered would form the foundation of the government's case, and my testimony would be essential for explaining the systematic nature of the criminal enterprise to a jury. You should understand that this investigation will likely take several years to fully prosecute. Complex RICO cases require extensive preparation, and defendants in cases like this often fight aggressively to avoid the serious prison sentences they're facing. She also warned me about the personal consequences I should expect. Once Delilah's arrest became public, my role in the investigation would inevitably become known. Our family would face intense scrutiny, and I would likely be vilified by some community members who viewed my actions as betraying family loyalty regardless of the crimes involved.
Federal prosecutors take witness protection seriously in cases like this, Agent Kovac assured me. While we don't anticipate direct threats to your safety, We'll be monitoring for any attempts at intimidation or retaliation throughout the prosecution process. The week following my meeting with Agent Kovac was surreal. I continued my normal routine, attending classes, working at Henderson and Associates, maintaining regular contact with my family, while knowing that Delilah's world was about to collapse completely. Every interaction with my parents felt weighted with the knowledge of what they would soon learn about their daughter's criminal activities. During this period, I also had to prepare for the personal aftermath of my decision. Once Delilah was arrested, our family relationships would be permanently altered. Some relatives would undoubtedly blame me for destroying Delilah's life, regardless of the crime she had committed. Others might question why I hadn't tried to convince her to stop her illegal activities rather than building a case for her prosecution. But every time I wavered in my resolve, I thought about the victims whose lives Delilah had systematically damaged. Maria, struggling to make payments on a car with hidden defects while working 2 jobs to support her daughter. The elderly couples who had been pressured into unfavorable financing agreements that consumed their fixed incomes. The young families who had trusted Delilah to help them purchase reliable transportation, only to be deliberately victimized by someone who viewed their vulnerability as opportunity. The contrast between these victims and Delilah's luxury lifestyle, funded entirely from their losses, reinforced my conviction that justice required her prosecution regardless of personal consequences. She had made her choices when she decided to build her wealth through systematic victimization of vulnerable people. Now, I was making mine about whether to protect her or protect her victims. On Friday afternoon, Agent Kovac called to confirm that all warrants had been approved and coordination with state authorities was complete. The enforcement actions would begin Monday morning at 8 a.m. with simultaneous raids on Hartwell Motors, the dealership's subsidiary offices, and the residences of key participants. "Everything is ready," Agent Kovac said. "Your sister and her associates will be in federal custody by Monday afternoon. Are you prepared for what comes next?" I took a deep breath before answering. I've been preparing for this since the day I learned what she was really doing. It's time to stop her from hurting anyone else. That weekend, I finally contacted my parents and asked them to meet me for dinner Sunday evening. It was time to prepare them for the fact that one of their daughters was about to be arrested as the leader of a criminal enterprise, and that their other daughter had been the one to gather the evidence that would put her in federal prison for decades. The girl who had been dismissed as too naive and academic for the real world was about to demonstrate exactly how effectively academic rigor and methodical investigation could be applied to bringing down sophisticated criminal operations. Monday morning would begin the final phase of a case that had transformed me from victim of family manipulation into architect of federal justice. Sunday evening arrived with unseasonably warm weather for November, and I found myself sitting across from my parents at Giuseppe's, the same Italian restaurant where our family had celebrated every major milestone for the past 15 years. The familiar red checkered tablecloths and the smell of garlic bread that once represented comfort and tradition now felt heavy with the weight of what I was about to reveal. My parents had arrived in good spirits, chatting about Delilah's recent promotion to regional finance director at Hartwell Motors and her plans to expand their operations into neighboring states. The irony was almost intolerable. They were celebrating what they saw as her legitimate business success, having no idea that her promotion was actually the formalization of her role as head of a criminal enterprise. My mother said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand, "You sounded so serious on the phone, sweetheart. Is everything all right with school? Your father and I were just saying how proud we are that you'll be graduating summa cum laude next month." I had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times over the past week, but sitting there, looking at their loving, unsuspecting faces, the words felt impossible to say. These were good people who had raised both their daughters to value honesty, hard work, and treating others with respect. They had no idea that one of those daughters had spent the past 3 years systematically violating every principle they had tried to instill. "Mom, Dad, there's something I need to tell you about Delilah," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "Tomorrow morning, she's going to be arrested by federal agents on charges of racketeering, fraud,
money laundering, and conspiracy. The silence that followed was deafening. My father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, and my mother's hand went to her chest as if she couldn't breathe. The normal restaurant sounds, conversations at other tables, the clinking of dishes, the soft jazz playing overhead, seemed to fade into background noise. "What are you talking about?" my father finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Arrested? Delilah? That's impossible. She works at a car dealership. She sells cars."
I spent the next hour carefully explaining what I had discovered about Delilah's criminal activities, starting with Jake Morrison's initial revelations and continuing through the systematic investigation that had revealed the full scope of her operations. I showed them copies of key documents, played excerpts from the audio recordings, and outlined the evidence that federal agents would use to support their charges. My mother's reaction was immediate and visceral. "This can't be true," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Delilah would never. She's ambitious, yes, but she's not a criminal. There has to be some mistake." But my father's response was more measured and ultimately more painful to witness. As I presented the evidence, I could see him recognizing patterns and behaviors that he had previously dismissed or rationalized. The expensive lifestyle that had seemed to exceed Delilah's legitimate income, the vague explanations of her work responsibilities, the gradual changes in her personality that had made her more calculating and less empathetic over the past 3 years. "How long have you known about this?" he asked, quietly. "I started investigating 2 months ago when Jake Morrison showed me evidence that she was involved in fraudulent car sales," I replied. "But the full scope of what she was doing, I only understood that in the past few weeks." "And you didn't think to warn her? To give her a chance to stop what she was doing?" my mother asked, her voice mixing hurt with accusation. This was the question I had been dreading, because it went to the heart of what made the situation so morally complex. "Mom, by the time I understood what she was doing, she had already victimized dozens of families. The evidence shows that her crimes were systematic and ongoing, with plans to expand to other states. This wasn't someone who had made a few bad decisions. This was someone who had built her entire adult life around criminal activities." I pulled out photos of some of the victims Jake and I had documented: Maria with her young daughter, elderly couples who had been pressured into unfavorable financing, young families struggling with payments on cars that had been deliberately sold with hidden defects. "These people trusted her," I said, spreading the photos across the table. "They came to her for help buying reliable transportation, and she systematically cheated them while building the lifestyle you've seen her living. Every expensive vacation, every designer outfit, every luxury item, it was all paid for with money stolen from families who could barely afford basic transportation." My father studied the photos for a long moment, then looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. He said simply, "You did the right thing. I don't like it, and it's going to destroy our family, but you did the right thing." My mother wasn't ready to accept that conclusion. "She's our daughter," she said desperately. "Family is supposed to protect family. There had to be another way to handle this." "What other way?" I asked gently. "She was expanding her operations to other states. The evidence shows she was planning to involve other dealerships in similar schemes. How many more families should I have let her victimize while I tried to convince her to stop doing something that was making her wealthy and successful?" The conversation continued for another hour, with my parents alternating between denial, anger, and devastating sadness. They asked about legal representation for Delilah, about the possibility of plea agreements, about whether her cooperation might reduce her sentence. I answered their questions as honestly as I could, while explaining that the federal charges she faced carried mandatory minimum sentences that would likely result in decades in prison. "There's something else you need to know," I said as we prepared to leave the restaurant. "My role in this investigation will become public during the prosecution. The media will likely portray this as a sister who betrayed her family,
and some people in the community will blame me for destroying Delilah's life. My father reached across the table and took my hand. "Let them blame you," he said firmly. "We know who you are, and we know why you did this. Anyone who thinks family loyalty means protecting criminals doesn't understand what family really means." My mother was still struggling with the reality of what I had told them, but she managed a weak smile. "Your father's right. We raised you to do what's right, even when it's difficult. I need time to process all of this." As we left the restaurant, my parents looked like they had aged years in the span of a few hours. The comfortable family dinner they had anticipated had become a devastating revelation that would fundamentally alter their understanding of one daughter, while forcing them to grapple with the actions of the other. I drove home that night knowing that Monday would bring not just Delilah's arrest, but the beginning of a family crisis that would test every relationship and assumption we had built over decades. Some relatives would blame me for the destruction of Delilah's life. Others would struggle to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the criminal she had actually become.
But I also knew that I had done everything possible to prepare my parents for what was coming. They would face the media attention and community scrutiny with at least some understanding of why I had made the choices I had made. And perhaps most importantly, they would face it knowing that their younger daughter had applied the values they had taught her to protect innocent people from systematic victimization. Monday morning, I woke before dawn and lay in bed thinking about the day ahead. By evening, Delilah would be in federal custody, her criminal enterprise would be dismantled, and our family would begin dealing with consequences that would echo for years to come. The girl who had been dismissed as too naive for the real world was about to watch federal agents arrest her sister based on evidence she had systematically gathered. But I felt no satisfaction or anticipation of revenge. Instead, I felt the weight of responsibility for ensuring that justice was served while minimizing the collateral damage to innocent family members who had never suspected what Delilah had really been doing. At 7:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Agent Kovac. "All teams in position. Operation begins in 30 minutes. Thank you for your courage in making this possible." I replied simply, "Thank you for believing the evidence and acting quickly. Those families deserve justice." In 30 minutes, the careful facades that Delilah had built around her criminal activities would be completely shattered. The sister who had always claimed to understand the real world better than I did was about to discover that the real world included consequences for systematic criminal behavior delivered by federal agents who didn't care about her charm or social connections. The academic skills she had dismissed as impractical had been used to build an unassailable case against her criminal enterprise. The methodical approach she had mocked as naive had proven more effective than her sophisticated manipulation tactics. And the sister she had considered too weak to succeed in the real world was about to watch her be led away in handcuffs. At exactly 8 a.m. on Monday morning, I was sitting in my constitutional law class when my phone vibrated with a message from Agent Kovac. "Phase 1 complete. Primary target in custody." I stared at the screen for a moment, processing the reality that my sister was now in federal custody, her criminal enterprise in ruins, and our family's life permanently altered. According to the plan Agent Kovac had outlined, federal agents had surrounded Hartwell Motors as employees arrived for work, presenting search warrants and arrest warrants simultaneously. Delilah had been taken into custody without incident while attempting to access her office computer, likely to delete incriminating evidence that agents were already in the process of securing. I struggled to focus on Professor Martinez's lecture about constitutional protections for criminal defendants, the irony not lost on me that I was learning about the very rights that would now protect my sister during her prosecution. My phone continued buzzing with updates throughout the morning as the coordinated federal operation unfolded across 3 counties.
By 10 a.m., Agent Kovac reported that Ryan Hartwell had been arrested at his residence, along with 2 of the subsidiary company managers who had been involved in the money laundering operations. Search warrants had been executed at 7 different locations, including the dealership, multiple business offices, and personal residences. Bank accounts containing over $800,000 in suspected criminal proceeds had been frozen pending asset forfeiture proceedings. The scope of the federal response was overwhelming even to me, despite having provided the evidence that made it possible. Agent Kovac had assembled a task force that included FBI agents, IRS criminal investigators, state automotive fraud specialists, and prosecutors from both federal and state jurisdictions. The simultaneous raids had been coordinated to prevent any possibility of evidence destruction or flight by the defendants. Between classes, I called my parents to check on how they were handling the news. My mother answered on the first ring, her voice strained with exhaustion despite the early hour. "It's all over the local news," she said without preamble. "They're calling it the largest automotive fraud bust in the region's history. The reporters are saying that dozens of families were victimized and that the operation involved multiple states." I could hear the television in the background, with news anchors discussing the dramatic federal raids and the serious charges facing the defendants. The coverage was extensive, reflecting both the scale of the criminal enterprise and the sophisticated nature of the law enforcement response. "How are you holding up?" I asked, though I could already hear the answer in her voice. "I keep expecting to wake up and discover this is all a nightmare," she admitted. "But then I see Delilah's picture on the news being led away in handcuffs, and I know it's real. How did we not know? How did we not see what she was doing?" It was a question that would haunt my parents for years, the realization that they had been celebrating what they thought was their daughter's legitimate business success, while she was actually building a criminal empire that systematically victimized vulnerable families.
By noon, the story had been picked up by regional media outlets, and I started receiving calls from reporters who had somehow obtained my contact information. I declined all interviews on advice from Attorney Henderson, who had warned me that anything I said publicly could potentially complicate the federal prosecution. The first call from someone I knew personally came from my roommate Jessica, who had seen the news coverage and immediately recognized Delilah's name. "Cassie, I just saw the news about your sister. Are you okay? This has to be devastating for your family." Jessica's concern was genuine, but I could hear the curiosity underlying her sympathy. Word would spread quickly through campus that my sister had been arrested as the leader of a major criminal enterprise. Some students would be sympathetic, others would be fascinated by the drama, and a few would probably view me with suspicion for being related to someone capable of such systematic criminal behavior. The afternoon brought more complex emotional challenges. At 2 p.m., I received a call from Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister, whose voice was sharp with accusation rather than concern. "Cassandra, your mother tells me that you're the one who provided evidence against Delilah," she said without preamble. "How could you do that to your own sister? Family is supposed to protect family no matter what." I had anticipated this reaction from some relatives, but hearing it directly was still painful. Aunt Patricia, Delilah was systematically stealing from working families to fund her lifestyle. The evidence shows she victimized dozens of people, including elderly couples and single mothers who trusted her to help them buy reliable transportation. "That's business," Aunt Patricia replied dismissively. "Maybe she was aggressive in her sales tactics, but that doesn't justify destroying her life. You could have talked to her, convinced her to change her methods. Instead, you chose to betray your own family." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Aunt Patricia expressing views that I knew were shared by other family members. In their minds, blood relationships created obligations that superseded legal or moral considerations. The fact that Delilah had committed serious crimes was less important than the fact that I had been the one to expose those crimes. But not all family reactions were negative.
At 4 p.m., I received a call from Brian, Aunt Patricia's son, who had always been close to both Delilah and me growing up. "Cassie, I want you to know that I think you did the right thing," he said firmly. "I've been following the news coverage, and what Delilah was doing was seriously messed up. Those families she cheated didn't deserve what happened to them." Brian went on to explain that he had actually purchased a car from Hartwell Motors 2 years ago and had experienced some of the deceptive practices that were now being prosecuted. "She sold me a car with transmission problems that she claimed had been fully inspected and repaired. When I brought it back with issues, she basically told me it was my problem. I ended up having to spend $3,000 on repairs that should have been disclosed before the sale." This revelation was particularly painful because it meant that Delilah had victimized even her own extended family members while maintaining the facade of business success. Brian's experience suggested that her criminal activities had been so systematic that she hadn't even exempted relatives from her fraudulent practices. The most difficult call came at 6 p.m. from Ryan Hartwell's mother, Eleanor, who was understandably distraught about her son's arrest. However, her anger was directed entirely at me, rather than at the criminal activities that had led to the federal charges. "You've destroyed 2 families with your accusations," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with rage. "Ryan and Delilah were building something successful together, and you've ruined it all because of jealousy and spite. My son is a good person who got caught up in something he didn't understand." Eleanor's characterization of the evidence as accusations and her suggestion that jealousy had motivated my investigation demonstrated how some people would interpret this situation regardless of the facts. In her mind, I was a vindictive sister who had used legal technicalities to destroy a legitimate business because I couldn't accept my sister's success. "Mrs. Hartwell, the evidence shows that your son and my sister operated a criminal enterprise that systematically defrauded dozens of families," I replied as gently as possible. But Eleanor wasn't interested in evidence or legal arguments. Like Aunt Patricia, she viewed the situation through the lens of personal loyalty rather than legal or moral considerations. The federal charges against her son were less important than her belief that I had betrayed family relationships by cooperating with law enforcement. By evening, I had received dozens of calls from family members, friends, reporters, and curious strangers who had obtained my contact information through various means. The reactions ranged from support and admiration to anger and condemnation, with most people falling somewhere in between, confused about how to process the revelation that someone they knew had been involved in such serious criminal activities.
That night, I sat in my dorm room reviewing news coverage of the federal raids while trying to process the emotional complexity of what I had set in motion. The headlines were dramatic. Federal agents dismantle multi-county auto fraud ring. Sophisticated criminal enterprise operated from local dealership. Dozens of families victimized in systematic fraud scheme. The coverage was generally accurate and properly emphasized the harm that had been done to vulnerable families throughout the region. Several victims had already been interviewed by reporters, sharing stories about how Delilah's criminal activities had affected their lives and expressing gratitude that the federal investigation had finally brought accountability. But the media attention also meant that my role in the investigation would inevitably become public knowledge. Agent Kovac had warned me that my cooperation with federal authorities would likely be revealed during court proceedings, making me a target for criticism from people who viewed family loyalty as more important than criminal justice. As I prepared for bed that night, my phone buzzed with one final message from Agent Kovac. "Excellent work today. All defendants in custody, evidence secured, assets frozen. Your courage made this possible. Prosecution team wants to meet with you this week to begin trial preparation." I replied, "Thank you for taking this seriously and acting quickly. Those families finally have justice." The girl who had been dismissed as too naive and academic for the real world had successfully brought down a sophisticated criminal enterprise using methodical investigation and federal prosecution. But the personal cost of that success
was only beginning to become apparent as our family and community struggled to process the reality of what Delilah had done and what I had done in response. 18 months after Delilah's arrest, I stood in the witness preparation room of the federal courthouse in Columbus, Ohio, reviewing my testimony one final time before taking the stand that would seal my sister's fate. The intervening months had been a whirlwind of depositions, evidence review sessions, and strategic meetings with the prosecution team as they built their case around the comprehensive investigation I had conducted. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michelle Torres had become my primary contact throughout the prosecution process, and she had been impressed by both the quality of evidence I had gathered and my ability to explain complex financial crimes to juries. "Your testimony will be the cornerstone of our case," she had told me during our final preparation session. "You're not just a witness. You're the person who uncovered and documented this entire criminal enterprise." The trial had been scheduled for November, almost exactly 2 years after I had first learned about Delilah's criminal activities from Jake Morrison. During those 2 years, my life had changed dramatically in ways I could never have anticipated. I had graduated summa cum laude from Millbrook State University, been accepted to Northwestern University Law School with a full scholarship, and spent my first year of law school studying the same federal criminal statutes that were now being used to prosecute my sister. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was pursuing the legal career Delilah had once dismissed as unrealistic, while she faced the possibility of spending decades in federal prison for crimes I had helped expose. The girl who had been too stupid for college was now a law student at one of the country's most prestigious institutions, while the sister who had claimed to understand the real world better was about to learn about the real consequences of systematic criminal behavior. Delilah's legal strategy had evolved considerably since her arrest. Initially, her attorneys had attempted to argue that she was merely a low-level employee following orders from Ryan Hartwell and his father. When that approach failed in the face of overwhelming evidence showing her central role in designing and implementing the criminal schemes, they had shifted to claiming that the fraudulent activities were standard industry practices rather than criminal behavior. But the prosecution's evidence was too comprehensive to allow for such defenses. The recordings, documents, and witness testimony I had gathered clearly demonstrated that Delilah had been the architect of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that went far beyond anything that could be characterized as aggressive sales tactics or industry standards. During the pretrial hearings, I had been forced to sit in the same courtroom as Delilah for the first time since her arrest. She had lost weight during her time in federal custody, and the designer clothes that once symbolized her success had been replaced by the standard attire of a criminal defendant. But what struck me most was the look of pure hatred she directed toward me whenever our eyes met. Throughout our childhood and adolescence, Delilah had viewed me with condescension, dismissiveness, or occasional frustration. But the look she gave me now was something entirely different. The look of someone who had been utterly defeated by an opponent she had never taken seriously. The sister she had spent years undermining and dismissing had not only succeeded beyond her expectations, but had also been the instrument of her complete downfall. The trial itself had been a media sensation, covered extensively by regional and national news outlets, fascinated by the story of a sister who had brought down a criminal enterprise operated by her own family member. I had been portrayed variously as a hero who had protected vulnerable consumers, a vindictive sibling motivated by jealousy, and a legal prodigy whose investigative skills had impressed federal prosecutors.
But the media attention had also taken a toll on my family relationships that extended far beyond my conflict with Delilah. Several relatives had stopped speaking to me entirely, viewing my cooperation with federal authorities as an unforgivable betrayal of family loyalty. Holiday gatherings had become tense affairs where half the family avoided mentioning the trial, while the other half debated whether I had done the right thing. My parents had struggled throughout the prosecution process, torn between pride in my principles and grief over Delilah's choices. They had attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row behind the prosecution table in a gesture of support that had been widely noted by media observers. Their presence had been particularly important during the victim impact testimony, when families like Maria's had described how Delilah's crimes had affected their lives. Now, as I prepared to deliver the testimony that would likely determine Delilah's sentencing, I reflected on how completely our roles had reversed since that day in high school when she had sabotaged my scholarship applications. She had used her position of power to try to limit my opportunities and keep me from achieving my potential. Now, I was using my education and legal knowledge to ensure that she faced appropriate consequences for victimizing innocent people. Attorney Torres knocked on the preparation room door, indicating that it was time for my testimony to begin. "Remember, just tell the truth about what you discovered and how you investigated it," she said. "The evidence speaks for itself, and your credibility is unquestionable. The jury needs to understand the systematic nature of the criminal enterprise and your sister's central role in operating it." As I walked through the courthouse hallway toward the courtroom, I passed a group of Delilah's victims who had traveled to Columbus to witness her sentencing. Maria was there with her now 8-year-old daughter, along with several of the elderly couples and young families whose lives had been damaged by the fraudulent car sales and financing schemes. "Thank you for having the courage to stop her," Maria said quietly as I passed. "My daughter and I can finally put this behind us now." Those words reinforced why I had made the choices I had made throughout this process. While some family members viewed my actions as betrayal, the people who had actually been harmed by Delilah's crimes understood that accountability was necessary for justice and healing. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, family members, victims, and curious observers who had followed the case since Delilah's dramatic arrest. Federal District Judge Robert Caldwell, a distinguished African-American man in his 60s, known for his expertise in complex financial crimes, presided over proceedings with the gravity that such serious charges demanded. As I approached the witness stand to be sworn in, I made eye contact with Delilah one final time. She was sitting at the defendant's table between her two attorneys, her expression combining resignation with lingering anger. This was the moment we had both been building towards since that day she had told our family I was too stupid for college and would never amount to anything. Judge Caldwell administered the oath with ceremonial precision. "Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do," I replied, my voice clear and confident, despite the emotional weight of the moment. Attorney Torres began her examination with questions designed to establish my credibility and explain how I had become involved in investigating Delilah's criminal activities. I testified about my legal education, my work at Henderson and Associates, and the methodical approach I had taken to gathering evidence once I learned about the fraudulent schemes. "Ms. Whitmore, in your investigation of the defendant's activities, what did you discover about the scope and systematic nature of the criminal enterprise she operated?" Torres asked. As I began explaining the comprehensive evidence I had compiled, the fraudulent sales practices, the money laundering operations, the expansion plans, the systematic victimization of vulnerable families, I realized that this testimony represented more than just the prosecution of criminal behavior. It was the complete vindication of every principle my parents had taught me about using education and legal knowledge to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The girl who had been dismissed as too naive for the real world was now explaining to a federal court how she had dismantled a sophisticated criminal enterprise using the same academic and analytical skills that Delilah had spent years mocking. And sitting just feet away, the sister who had claimed to understand the real world better was learning that the real world included federal judges, experienced prosecutors, and lengthy prison sentences for people who built their success on systematic criminal behavior. This was the moment I had been preparing for. Since that day, I decided to investigate rather than ignore what Jake Morrison had shown me. Not revenge, but justice. Not family loyalty,
but protection of innocent people who had trusted someone who viewed their vulnerability as opportunity. The testimony that would complete Delilah's downfall was about to begin. My testimony lasted 3 days, during which I systematically presented the evidence that dismantled any remaining doubt about Delilah's guilt and the scope of her criminal enterprise. Attorney Torres guided me through each category of evidence: the fraudulent sales documentation, the money laundering schemes, the victim testimonies, the expansion plans, while Delilah's defense attorneys attempted increasingly desperate cross-examination strategies.
On the first day, I explained how I had initially discovered the fraudulent activities through Jake Morrison's documentation of his cousin, Maria's case. I testified about finding Tommy Chen and learning how Delilah had systematically corrupted the dealership's operations, transforming what had once been a legitimate business into a criminal enterprise designed to victimize vulnerable customers. Ms. Whitmore, did you find evidence that the defendant specifically targeted certain types of customers for her fraudulent schemes? Attorney Torres asked. Yes, I replied, referring to Rebecca Walsh's recordings of employee training sessions. The evidence shows that my sister developed detailed psychological profiles for maximizing profits from different demographic groups. She taught employees specific techniques for manipulating elderly customers, young buyers, and low-income families based on their vulnerabilities. I played excerpts from the recordings where Delilah could be heard explaining how to exploit each group's particular weaknesses: elderly customers who could be confused by complex financing terms, young buyers who could be impressed by cosmetic improvements that hid mechanical problems, and poor families who could be pressured into accepting unfavorable terms by emphasizing their limited options. The courtroom was silent as Delilah's voice filled the space, methodically outlining strategies for systematic victimization. Several jury members appeared visibly disturbed by the calculated nature of her approach to targeting vulnerable people. Even Delilah's own attorney seemed unprepared for the damning nature of these recordings. On the second day, I testified about the financial structure Delilah had created to launder the proceeds from her criminal activities. Using Marcus Thompson's accounting documentation and my own analysis of the corporate filings, I explained how she had established 7 different business entities to move money through multiple accounts while avoiding regulatory oversight. The defendant created what amounted to a sophisticated money laundering operation, I explained to the jury. Money from fraudulent sales and false insurance claims would be transferred through multiple corporate accounts to make it appear like legitimate business income. The complexity was designed to prevent detection by banking regulators or tax authorities. I presented flowcharts I had created showing how money moved through Delilah's network of companies, demonstrating that over $800,000 in criminal proceeds had been laundered during the 2-year period documented by the prosecution. The systematic nature of the financial crimes was as impressive as it was illegal, showing a level of sophistication that contradicted any claims that Delilah had been a low-level participant in someone else's scheme. During cross-examination, Delilah's lead attorney, William Brennan, attempted to portray me as a vindictive sister motivated by jealousy rather than justice. Ms. Whitmore, isn't it true that you resented your sister's business success and her lifestyle? He asked. No, I replied, firmly. I resented that her lifestyle was funded by systematically cheating vulnerable families. The evidence shows that every luxury vacation, every designer purchase, every expensive dinner was paid for with money stolen from people who trusted her to help them buy reliable transportation. Brennan continued this line of questioning for several hours, suggesting that I had misinterpreted standard business practices as criminal behavior because of personal animosity toward Delilah. But his strategy backfired when Attorney Torres presented evidence showing that I actually tried to find alternative explanations for the suspicious patterns before concluding that criminal activity was involved. I didn't want to believe my sister was committing crimes. I spent weeks looking for legitimate explanations for the evidence I was seeing. It was only when the documentation became overwhelming that I accepted the reality of what she was doing. On the third day of my testimony, I presented evidence of Delilah's expansion plans and her role as the architect of a regional criminal network. Using documents Tommy Chen had provided and contracts I had obtained through federal subpoenas, I showed how she had been establishing consulting agreements with other automotive businesses to export her fraudulent practices across multiple states. The defendant wasn't just operating a local fraud scheme. She was building a criminal enterprise designed to victimize consumers throughout the Midwest. The evidence shows she had plans to expand to at least 6 additional states within the next 2 years. This testimony was particularly devastating because it demonstrated clear intent to continue and expand criminal activities rather than any recognition that her behavior was wrong. Delilah hadn't been caught in isolated bad decisions. She had been building a criminal empire that would have affected thousands of additional families if it hadn't been stopped. During the final phase of cross-examination, Brennan made a tactical error that effectively ended any remaining defense strategy. He asked whether I had considered the impact my investigation would have on our family relationships. Of course I considered the impact, but I also considered the impact my sister's crimes were having on dozens of innocent families. Maria, who works 2 jobs to support her daughter and was cheated out of thousands of dollars. Elderly couples on fixed incomes who were pressured into unfavorable financing agreements. Young families who trusted my sister to help them buy reliable transportation and instead were deliberately sold cars with hidden defects. I gestured toward the victim seating area where many of the people Delilah had victimized were watching the proceedings. Every single one of those families trusted my sister, and she systematically betrayed that trust for financial gain. When I had to choose between protecting her and protecting them, the choice was clear.
Brennan had inadvertently allowed me to articulate the moral framework that had guided my decisions throughout this investigation. Rather than portraying me as a vindictive family member, his question had given me the opportunity to explain why justice sometimes requires difficult personal choices. When my testimony concluded, Judge Caldwell thanked me for my cooperation with the investigation and my clear presentation of complex evidence. As I stepped down from the witness stand, I made eye contact with Delilah one final time. The hatred was still there, but it was now mixed with something else. The recognition that she had been completely outmaneuvered by the sister she had never taken seriously. The prosecution rested their case the following day, and Delilah's defense team offered only token resistance before advising her to accept a plea agreement rather than risk a conviction at trial. The evidence I had presented was too comprehensive and too well documented to challenge effectively. 3 weeks later, Delilah pleaded guilty to federal racketeering charges, conspiracy, money laundering, and multiple counts of consumer fraud. The plea agreement called for a sentence of 15 to 20 years in federal prison, with restitution payments to victims totaling over $1.2 million. At the sentencing hearing, Judge Caldwell addressed Delilah directly before imposing the final sentence. Miss Hartwell, you operated a sophisticated criminal enterprise that systematically victimized vulnerable consumers while enriching yourself through their losses. The evidence shows that you specifically targeted elderly customers, young families, and low-income individuals because you viewed their vulnerabilities as business opportunities. Judge Caldwell paused, reviewing the victim impact statements that had been submitted to the court. The harm you caused extends far beyond financial losses. You betrayed the trust of people who came to you for help, and you corrupted a business that should have served your community. The systematic nature of your crimes and your plans for expansion demonstrate a level of criminal sophistication that requires a significant period of incarceration to protect the public. Therefore, this court sentences you to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $1,247,000 to the victims of your crimes, and you are permanently barred from working in any capacity in the automotive finance industry. As the bailiff led Delilah away in shackles, she turned to look at me one final time. The hatred was still there, but so was something else. The complete understanding that the sister she had dismissed as too stupid for college had just watched her receive an 18-year federal prison sentence based on evidence she had systematically gathered and presented. The girl who would never amount to anything had brought down a criminal enterprise and secured justice for dozens of victims. And the sister who had claimed to understand the real world better was beginning an 18-year journey to discover what the real world did to people who built their success on systematic criminal behavior. Judge Caldwell's gavel fell with finality, and Delilah Hartwell disappeared into the federal prison system where she would spend the next 2 decades of her life.
The courtroom erupted in applause from the victims and their families, finally seeing justice served after years of being victimized by someone they had trusted. But for me, there was no sense of triumph or satisfaction, only the quiet knowledge that I had done what needed to be done to protect innocent people from further harm. The academic skills that Delilah had mocked had proven more powerful than her criminal sophistication. The legal knowledge she had dismissed as impractical had been used to build an unassailable case that ended her criminal career permanently. The real world, it turned out, included consequences that no amount of charm or manipulation could avoid. 5 years after Delilah's sentencing, I stood in the judicial chambers of the Riverside County Superior Court, adjusting my black robes for my first day as the Honorable Judge Cassandra Whitmore. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. The same courthouse where I had testified against my sister's criminal enterprise was now where I would preside over cases involving financial crimes, consumer fraud, and white-collar criminal behavior. My path to the bench had been accelerated by the recognition I received for my role in dismantling Delilah's criminal network. After graduating from Northwestern Law School magna cum laude, I had been recruited by the U.S. Attorney's Office to work as a federal prosecutor specializing in complex financial crimes. My experience with the Hartwell Motors case had given me unique insights into how sophisticated criminal enterprises operated and how to build unassailable cases against them. During my 3 years as a federal prosecutor, I had successfully prosecuted 17 major fraud cases, including several that involved multi-state criminal networks similar to what Delilah had been building. My reputation for thorough investigation and meticulous case preparation had earned me recognition from the Department of Justice and recommendations from federal judges who had overseen my prosecutions. When the position on the Riverside County Superior Court became available, the Judicial Nominating Commission had been unanimous in their recommendation of my candidacy. At 31 years old, I was young for a judicial appointment, but my combination of prosecutorial experience, academic credentials, and demonstrated commitment to protecting vulnerable consumers made me an ideal candidate for a court that handled significant financial crime cases.
The morning of my first day as a judge, I found a handwritten note on my desk from Judge Robert Caldwell, who had presided over Delilah's sentencing hearing 5 years earlier. Judge Whitmore, it read, "Your journey from witness to prosecutor to jurist represents the best traditions of American justice. The legal system needs judges who understand both the academic principles of law and the real-world impact of criminal behavior on innocent people. Congratulations on this well-deserved appointment." My first case was a mortgage fraud prosecution involving a defendant who had systematically cheated elderly homeowners out of their properties through deceptive refinancing schemes. As I reviewed the case files, I couldn't help but see parallels to the victimization strategies Delilah had employed at Hartwell Motors. The same psychological manipulation, the same targeting of vulnerable populations, the same rationalization of criminal behavior as legitimate business practices. During the arraignment proceedings, I found myself looking at the defendant with the same analytical perspective I had developed while investigating my sister's crimes. The challenge would be ensuring that my personal experience with financial fraud enhanced rather than biased my judicial decision-making. Later that afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor in my chambers. Maria Gonzalez, now 35 and working as a paralegal at a victims' rights organization, had requested a meeting to thank me personally for the role I had played in bringing Delilah to justice. "Judge Whitmore," she said, her voice warm with genuine gratitude, "I wanted you to know that my daughter is now 13 years old and an honor roll student. The restitution money from your sister's conviction allowed us to get reliable transportation and move to a better neighborhood with better schools. Your courage in standing up to family pressure literally changed our lives." Maria went on to explain that she had used her experience as a fraud victim to become an advocate for other families who had been cheated by unscrupulous businesses. She now worked with the state attorney general's office to identify and prosecute consumer fraud cases using the same methodical documentation techniques I had employed in building the case against Delilah. You taught me that ordinary people can fight back against criminals who think they're too smart to be caught, Maria said. Your investigation showed that systematic evidence gathering and legal knowledge are more powerful than criminal sophistication. That evening, I called my parents to update them on my first day as a judge. The years since Delilah's conviction had been difficult for our family, but they had gradually come to terms with the choices both their daughters had made. My father had become something of a local celebrity, proudly telling anyone who would listen that his younger daughter was now a federal judge at 31. "We're so proud of who you've become," my mother said, her voice reflecting both joy and the lingering sadness that had marked our family since Delilah's arrest. "You've built something meaningful from a terrible situation." My parents had received occasional letters from Delilah during her incarceration, but the correspondence had been sporadic and largely focused on her own grievances rather than any acknowledgement of the harm she had caused. According to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, she had not participated in any rehabilitation programs and had been involved in several disciplinary incidents related to her attempts to manipulate other inmates and staff. "Has she shown any remorse for what she did?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Not really," my father replied sadly. "Her letters mostly complain about prison conditions and blame everyone else for her situation. She still sees herself as the victim of an unfair system rather than someone who chose to victimize innocent people." This information wasn't surprising, but it was disappointing. Despite the overwhelming evidence of her crimes and the testimony from dozens of victims, Delilah apparently remained convinced that she had been the victim of overzealous prosecution rather than the architect of systematic criminal behavior. 3 months into my tenure as a judge, I was assigned a case that brought my personal and professional experiences full circle. The defendant was Gerald Morrison, Jake Morrison's uncle, who had been charged with operating an automotive parts fraud scheme that targeted rural car owners through deceptive online sales and false warranty claims. During the pretrial hearings, Jake Morrison appeared in my courtroom as a witness for the prosecution. He had become a successful mechanic and auto repair shop owner, and his testimony about his uncle's fraudulent practices was thorough and well documented. "Your Honor," Jake said during a brief recess, "I want you to know that the investigation techniques you taught me during the Hartwell Motors case have helped me identify and report several other fraud schemes in our community. You showed me that systematic evidence gathering and legal knowledge are more powerful than criminal sophistication." Jake's comment reinforced a lesson I had learned throughout this journey. The skills and principles that had enabled me to bring down Delilah's criminal enterprise weren't unique to that situation. They were tools that could be applied to protecting consumers and prosecuting fraud wherever it occurred. As I prepared to sentence Gerald Morrison, who had pleaded guilty to charges remarkably similar to those that had sent Delilah to federal prison, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that day I had first learned about fraudulent car sales at a copy center 5 years earlier. The girl who had been too stupid for college was now presiding over a courtroom where she would spend her career protecting the same types of vulnerable consumers my sister had systematically victimized. The academic achievements that Delilah had mocked as impractical had become the foundation for a judicial career focused on ensuring that criminals faced appropriate consequences for their actions. More importantly, the investigation that had begun with my decision to protect innocent people rather than family loyalty had evolved into a lifelong commitment to using legal knowledge and judicial authority to serve justice. Every case I would hear, every sentence I would impose, every legal precedent I would establish would be informed by the understanding that the law exists to protect people who cannot protect themselves. That evening, as I removed my judicial robes and prepared to leave chambers, I found myself thinking about Delilah for the first time in months. She was now in the 7th year of her 18-year sentence, with more than a decade of incarceration still ahead of her. By the time she was released, I would likely be serving on a federal appellate court or state Supreme Court, having built a distinguished judicial career on the foundation of the investigation that had brought her to justice. The sister, who had said I would always fail, was now addressing me as Your Honor in the letters her attorney occasionally sent to my chambers requesting sentence reductions that I was legally prohibited from considering. The woman who had claimed I was too naive for the real world was learning that the real world included judges who understood exactly how criminal enterprises operated and who were committed to ensuring that justice was both swift and comprehensive. But more than personal vindication, my judicial appointment represented something larger: proof that academic excellence, methodical investigation, and unwavering commitment to justice could triumph over criminal sophistication, family pressure, and community skepticism. The legal system had worked exactly as it was designed to work, protecting vulnerable consumers while holding criminals accountable, regardless of their family connections or social status. As I walked out of the courthouse, where I would spend my career serving justice, I realized that Delilah had been wrong about everything except one crucial detail. I had indeed failed to be the person she expected me to be. Instead, I had become something far more powerful and far more dangerous to people like her. I had become a judge. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.